Okay, so whenever you have a new technology, governments, we've heard a lot about governments today, we've heard about various industry bodies getting involved. Whenever you get a new technology, whether it's GSM and mobile back in the mid-80s or the internet protocol that appeared shortly after that, you need organizations to create standards around those modern emerging technologies. So the BSI, the British Standards Institute, is driving a program right now, an ISO program, to look at blockchain. In fact, I think it's fair to say the UK is taking a global leadership position in establishing what the standards are around blockchain, not just cryptocurrency, but blockchain generally. So I'm delighted to welcome up Mr. Stephen Holmes next. He is on the panel driving the strategy. So let's hear it from Mr. Stephen Holmes.
Thank you. So I'm going to start my presentation, first of all, with a disclaimer, but you'll understand why this is important as I go through this presentation. So I actually don't work for the ISO organization, or BSI, and I'm not part of the government. My day job is I'm a CTO for a blockchain startup, currently in stealth mode, as well as doing a PhD. So essentially, the reason I wanted to share that with you is, unlike other countries, where, for example, in the US, if you want to be part of the national standards body, you basically have to work for a very large corporation that pays a lot of money in order to be part of that. If you work for a country, if you're in a country like China, then it's more of a government appointment in order to be part of that standards body. In the UK, it's really about experts coming together, and what I'm really proud of actually in the UK is the experts we have are actually from industry. So we have a very big involvement from industry that are real blockchain, day-to-day businesses that are actually working with this. And I think that's really one of the vibrancies we have in the UK that really is really going to make a difference in the long term. So that's one of the first things I wanted to share with you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in terms of the standards. Now, first of all, how many of you heard of ISO TC307? Nobody. Okay. So unfortunately, it's a bit of a non-snappy title, but actually ISO Technical Committee 307 is the Blockchain and DLT Standards Committee, and that is essentially where the blockchain standards will emerge from over time from ISO. Now, you may well know there are many ISO standards. There are many different types of standards. They don't always have to be ISO, but essentially, in general terms globally, ISO is seen as kind of a gold standard. And when you want to procure something, you normally want to actually ensure that the products and services actually comply with ISO standards. So it really is a global standard. There really is a series of working groups. I'll go through that. I'll also share with you what the current UK landscape is and the roadmap and next steps, and an overall kind of, if you like, timeline for all this activity. So we have currently, and this has actually changed a little bit more, there are more than 40 countries involved in this. So when we're talking about actually having meetings to discuss the standards, first of all, what happens is there are three types of standards. There really is a technical report, which is the first stage normally. Then you have a technical standard that's published, and finally you have an international standard. So essentially that's how the ISO group works. And what happens is the standards are actually created initially by the people who are actually subject matter experts from the national bodies. And so that really means, from a UK perspective, because we're actually drawing in from people within the UK blockchain, if you like, ecosystem, then we're able to practically shape some of those standards. It's actually really an important point, and one of the things I would say as I'm here, and it's kind of a startup environment, normally you'd sort of end the presentation saying we're hiring, but at the same time I think there is a real opportunity to get involved in this. There are many new committees, many new opportunities to actually get involved, to actually shape some of these standards with the BSI. So we started this originally in April in Sydney. There was a midterm review in Tokyo, and we've had a meeting in May in London. So essentially, a lot of the progress was made in order to really move things forward. Now, it takes time to develop an international standard, and I can tell you that, when you're talking about 40 countries, it's not just the developed countries, it can be the developing countries, You can have other bodies as well involved, which are actually liaison bodies. So it could be SWIFT, it could be the ITU, it could be the European Commission, for example. And all of these bodies participate in some way to review the standards documents. From a practical perspective, what it means is if you are involved in this, then you basically have to work to an international schedule. So the meetings are held at 5 a.m., 11 p.m. at night, or 1 o'clock London time. So one of the things, I would warn anybody thinking about this is you do have to be available at those times. But one of the challenges also is how do you get consensus? And what you normally have is you have a project leader and you have the people who are editing the documents and sharing that information. So I'll move on a little bit. Okay, can you move forward a little bit? So the challenge really is how do we develop these protocols and standards? Can you move forward? And a little bit more. So this is really just showing essentially the charter, if you like. And one of the barriers to adoption of any technology is really if you don't have a standard, how do I actually know you can have a de facto standard, but there's no guarantee internationally it's going to be accepted. So it's a really important if you like, way of reducing the barrier and uncertainty in a global marketplace. So it might not be a fast process, but it's really an essential process in order to actually have a new technology adopted. What I want to say is, first of all, there are kind of 8 main working groups. So I'm going to ask you really, looking at these, how many of these do you think the UK is actually leading? Bearing in mind there are 40 countries. No? Not all of them, but let me tell you which ones we are involved in. So we're actually involved in the privacy group. I actually lead that group. We're involved in identity. We also are involved in interoperability and use cases. So 4 out of the 8 groups, we actually are playing a leading role in actually shaping those standards. So that's really an important thing to really share with you. That may be actually as a convener, or it may actually be as an editor of the document, and both are important roles. And essentially what you really get there is out of this, we really are leading the charge in terms of writing the standards and comparing that, not just as a new standard, but building upon existing standards. So what you saw in the previous chart was some of those activities now are in joint working groups. So it's not just in the ISO TC307, but also with Standing Committee 27, which is the security group within ISO. So things like security, privacy, and identity are now in a joint working group so that it actually all aligns. Okay? So this is the overall, if you like, schedule of what's actually happening. I can't go into more detail on this because clearly, this is kind of an external presentation, but essentially what you see is the end date is 2020, and it really is about driving that through. The next meeting is actually in Dublin, that's in April, this next year, and there will be a further meeting actually later on in the year in India. And normally what happens is, as working on the group with the team, is you drive the deliverables, which can be the technical reports, the technical standards, to meet the deadlines for these plenary meetings to make decisions on those documents. So that's essentially the process, and I think, from a UK perspective, I think we should be proud that we're actually making a difference and leading some of these standards. And I think from an industry perspective, it's really important that we are able to participate and really drive this through. And as I say, if anybody's interested in actually joining and working with me, please contact me, because I think the more people we have as experts on the committee, the better it is. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, let's actually lead off on that. Generally, who would like to be involved in this? Who would like to be involved in the standards bodies? How many places have you got, Stephen?
I'm glad that you said that, and some people clearly like early morning and late evening, so that's good. I was in full disclosure sharing that with you.
I think the point that I liked about this is that the UK is taking a leadership role in this space. And in fact, the reason why it exists is a foundation. The London Blockchain Foundation is all about driving the conversation forward inside the London world of blockchain, okay? And so often it gets caught up in the whole ICO pitching story, and that's what we're trying to avoid here. So I think when you see stuff like this, it's another angle altogether on where blockchain is going, right? So in your opinion, is London genuinely leading the world in the story around standards?
So I think we have a native advantage with the English language in terms of writing the documents, but it's only an advantage if we really press home that advantage and we really are able to be effective at not only writing the standards, but also in a way that what we're able to do is we're able to agree a form of consensus. So essentially it's not just about writing the standard, it's about negotiating internationally. And this is a really useful skill for anybody who gets involved in this in many walks of life. And to be able to work internationally is kind of a rare privilege.
Okay, Ariel, you got a question?
I do. In your experience so far, what would you say are some of the most contentious issues that you're standardizing and where you're finding it hardest to get that consensus?
So I think part of the issue is the level of maturity, particularly around the reference architecture and terminology. So what we've found is some of those foundation things took a long time to agree, because we basically have to come and bring that together. And then you have things like interoperability between blockchains, which is now starting to become an interesting property, but it's taken a while to get to that level. The second thing really is when we really look at the different countries, you find that clearly different countries have different perspectives. So let me give you an example. I chair the privacy group. You can imagine that Russia and China have a very different view of what privacy means versus the UK. So how do you actually agree on these things? And part of it is by consensus, part of it is really by just going through and convincing people this is the right approach, it aligns with the United Nations, etc. But there are some issues that take a while to actually get consensus, and you may have to just vote on those things, which is what happens at the national body ballots.
Who's next? Guy's already got a microphone. Whoa, prepared.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for the presentation. It was excellent. Just a question about, in terms of industry representation, how is industry represented? Because you said many countries, 40 countries are there. So is there a fair representation of the industry?
So I would say it's evolving, because I think we all recognize that financial services were really one of the first parties to get involved. They're no longer just financial services. You know, I think there are a number of other industries now participating. And in fact, one of the areas we as a UK lead is really the collection of use cases and publishing use cases. And over time, what we found is we've moved away from purely looking at financial services use cases into a more varied set of use cases across multiple industries.
Thank you.
Let's have one more. Shigan. Sorry, this lady here is first.
Hello, sorry. Thank you very much for a fantastic night and for all the presentations tonight. I wonder if you are engaging with the regulators and is there any appetite from the regulatory bodies to engage with you?
So yes, I think the regulators are involved in this. I mean, for example, I spent some time in the European Commission working with the regulators there. So, you know, there are different regulators that get involved and review the standard. And, you know, clearly I think it's important that the regulators are part of this. Now, I have to say that it does vary by country and by regulation. But essentially, you know, working in an area, I work on the privacy side, which is not just the technology, but really the legal aspects, and really understanding how the different jurisdictional aspects will apply and how do you come across with a global standard that can address this, really. So yes, the regulatory bodies are involved, but at different levels depending upon the national bodies and how they involve them. Well, I think partly it's been the financial services because of the initial financial services. It's a regulated industry, but increasingly, you know, what we see is that security is involved, so, you know, national bodies with security interests get involved. You also really have the whole issue around if I'm going to use blockchain for this, how does it work in my industry? So, within every industry, there's a certain set of regulators that are involved. So if it's actually food, it's the Food Standards Agency, for example. So, depending upon the industry, there are different regulatory bodies that actually get involved.
Tony, just building on that comment and to Tony's other comment about a solution looking for a problem, do you find that the buzzword value of blockchain keeps the pressure off? If you're a regulated industry, people are on your back and you tell them you're building some sort of blockchain solution to solve all of the world's problems, do they leave you alone for a little while, or is it just a complete smoke and mirrors exercise?
Well, I guess, speaking as myself in terms of my day job, I've been fortunate enough to work in multiple projects around the world in blockchain, in different industries as well. And so, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the business case. The technology won't survive on its own without a strong business case. And it's not just the business case, it's about the strategy of that particular company within that industry. So I think without those, whatever technology it is, we're talking blockchain and DLT systems today, but it doesn't really matter what the technology is. Ultimately, it has to really deliver on the business case.
Okay, last question from Shaken, and then we're going to wrap up. Let's go, sir.
Again, thank you very much for your presentation. It's refreshing to see standards developing, obviously. But how do you reconcile that with the fact that this is an emerging technology and that things are moving so quickly? And what kind of response do you get from the market?
So actually, when we started this, I think it was a big concern, because things were moving pretty quickly. But at the same time, what you see is that, there has been a level of maturing in the industry. There are standard ways of now, there are companies now delivering interoperability between blockchains, and there are standard ways of doing things. They may be different, but essentially, part of the challenge was to create a reference architecture model that actually could encompass all the technologies. So I think the actual level of technology and that maturity is happening to the level that you can start to standardize it. But it's never going to be an industry standard like Ethereum Alliance, because that's specifically about standardizing that product. What it will give you is addressing the issues that you have to be concerned about when you're building a solution that really, in terms of compliance, and particularly, thinking about this in a global world, you have to be thinking about privacy, you have to be thinking about what's, the governance model for this stuff. Because if somebody pops up online in Russia and for example, I'm picking on Russia, but it could be any other country, and basically put something on there, what are your regulations? How do you actually engage with that? What happens if the mining of your blockchain is actually not governed in any way? So there's a lot of existing standards that you can build from, but it's how do you apply it to this new world?
Okay, thank you very much.
Well done ignoring the chime there. Outstanding. That is literally time up. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Stephen. Well done. Outstanding. Thank you. Just going to hand you over to Olga just to close the event. Thank you very much for your time tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Cheers.
Well, thank you everyone for staying with us and listening to all these really interesting presentations. And now I would like to introduce the person who was really patiently waiting there to actually bring some party spirit to our drinks. It's Lucas. So he's going to play some guitar, some really nice tunes, while you have an opportunity to talk to each other, to talk to the presenters if you have further questions, and of course have drinks. And thank you again for coming. And see you at other events. We'll be doing some events next year. And also, if you want to join the group, please check our LinkedIn profile. You can also apply for membership. Also, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Thank you.